The rain poured down in relentless sheets that night, the kind of storm that seemed to echo the chaos inside our tiny house. I was 6 years old, lying awake in my small bed tucked into the corner of the living room because we couldn't afford another bedroom. The thunder roared like a monster outside, but it wasn't what woke me up. It was the sound of muffled sobs coming from the kitchen. My heart raced as I tiptoed out of bed, clutching my blanket tightly around me for comfort. There, sitting at the worn wooden table with her face buried in her hands, was Grandma. Her shoulders shook violently, and the dim light from the flickering bulb above cast shadows across her tear-streaked face. I didn't understand much back then, only that something terrible had happened. When I asked her why she was crying, she looked at me with eyes so full of pain they could have shattered glass. "Your father, he's remarried," she whispered between choked breaths. That moment felt like the ground beneath me crumbled away. It wasn't just the news itself, it was the finality of it all. He hadn't just left us when Mom died. He had erased us completely, moving on without even a backward glance. And now, this stranger would take his place, filling the void where once there had been love, or so I imagined. Life after that revelation became an endless uphill battle. School was no refuge either. By the time I reached elementary school, kids already knew how to sniff out weakness like predators circling prey. They taunted me during recess, calling me names like orphan or half-child. One particularly cruel boy once shouted, "Where's your daddy? Did he run away because you're ugly?" Those words stung worse than any slap. I ran home sobbing every single day, feeling like I carried some invisible scarlet letter branding me as incomplete. But whenever I burst through the door, tears streaming down my cheeks, Grandma would be there waiting. She'd pull me close, rocking me gently while murmuring soothing words into my ear. "You are loved, Jenny," she'd say firmly, as if trying to will those words into my very soul. "This family right here you need, and Grandpa, that's all the family you need." Sometimes, Grandpa would shuffle over silently, his weathered hands patting my shoulder awkwardly but meaningfully. Their reassurances were like patches stitched onto a fraying quilt, holding everything together despite the cracks threatening to tear us apart. Still, the weight of absence lingered heavily over our household. Every holiday season reminded us of who wasn't there. Birthdays passed without phone calls or presents from Dad. Even mundane moments, a soccer game at school, a parent-teacher meeting, became glaring reminders of what we lacked. But perhaps the hardest part was watching Grandma try to mask her own grief behind forced smiles. Late at night, when she thought everyone was asleep, I'd hear her quietly weeping in the laundry room, the sound mingling with the hum of the washing machine. Those nights broke my young heart more than anything else. And yet, amidst all the hardship, there were glimmers of hope too. Like the time Grandma saved up enough money to buy me a bright pink backpack covered in cartoon characters for my first day of 3rd grade. Or the way Grandpa secretly slipped candy bars into my lunchbox when Grandma wasn't looking. These little acts of love weren't grand gestures, but they spoke volumes about their sacrifices and devotion. They taught me resilience, not just to survive, but to find joy even in the smallest victories. By the time I reached 7th grade, life with Grandma and Grandpa had become a delicate balancing act. We were holding on by threads, but those threads were fraying faster than any of us wanted to admit. Grandpa, who had always been the quiet backbone of our family, was struggling more than ever at his job at the post office. His health had taken a nosedive after years of hard work and stress, and it felt like every day brought new challenges we weren't prepared for. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table finishing my homework, I overheard him talking in hushed tones with Grandma about how his boss had hinted that he might be let go if his performance didn't improve. The thought of losing his income terrified all of us. It wasn't just money. It was stability, security, the illusion that things could still somehow stay together. Grandma didn't waste time wallowing in fear. Instead, she doubled down, taking on 2 additional part-time jobs almost overnight. She worked mornings cleaning houses, afternoons stocking shelves at the grocery store, and late nights folding laundry for a local hotel. Her schedule was relentless, leaving her barely enough time to eat or sleep. I tried not to show how scared I was, but inside, I felt like we were standing on the edge of a cliff, one misstep away from falling into an abyss. Every night, I'd lie awake listening for the sound of her key turning in the lock, praying she'd come home safe. Sometimes, when she finally did walk through the door, she looked so exhausted that even smiling seemed like too much effort. But she never complained, not once. To her, complaining would have meant admitting defeat, and Grandma wasn't the kind of person to give up without a fight. Then came that freezing winter morning that changed everything. It was early, the kind of cold where the air bites your skin and frost clings stubbornly to the windows. I woke up earlier than usual because something felt off. The house was eerily silent, except for the faint hum of the heater struggling against the chill. When I went to check on Grandma, expecting to find her already dressed and ready for another grueling day, I instead found her collapsed on the bathroom floor. My heart stopped. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at her pale face, her body slumped against the tiles, and wonder if this was the moment everything fell apart. "Grandma," I screamed, dropping to my knees beside her. Her eyes fluttered open weakly, and she managed a faint smile. "I'm okay, Jenny," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "Just tired," but I knew better. This wasn't just exhaustion, it was the toll of working herself to the bone, of carrying the weight of 3 lives on her shoulders without complaint. I helped her to bed, tears streaming down my face, and called Grandpa, who rushed home immediately. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his hands shaking as he held hers. That day, I skipped school for the first time in my life. I couldn't leave them, not when they needed me most. As the hours passed, anger began to replace my fear. Anger at myself for not doing more, at the world for being so unfair, and at Dad for abandoning us when we needed him most. How dare he leave us to struggle like this? How dare he think we didn't matter enough to stick around? And yet, amidst the anger, there was also determination, a fierce resolve bubbling inside me. I realized then that I couldn't change the past, but I could shape the future. If Grandma and Grandpa were willing to sacrifice everything for me, the least I could do was make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain. From that day forward, I threw myself into my studies with a single-minded intensity that surprised even me. I stayed up late poring over textbooks, memorizing formulas, and practicing essays until my eyes burned. During lunch breaks, while other kids played outside, I sat alone in the library, determined to absorb every bit of knowledge I could. I didn't care about making friends or fitting in anymore. I cared about proving to Grandma and Grandpa that their efforts mattered. Every A on a test, every compliment from a teacher, was a small victory in the war we were fighting against despair. But it wasn't easy. There were days when the pressure felt unbearable, when the weight of expectations crushed me like a boulder. Some nights, I cried myself to sleep, wondering if I was strong enough to keep going. Yet, whenever doubt crept in, I remembered Grandma lying on the bathroom floor, her frail body a testament to her love and resilience. That image became my anchor, grounding me when the storms of life threatened to sweep me away. Looking back now, I realized that moment wasn't just about survival, it was about finding purpose. It taught me that sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought with fists or words, but with grit and determination. And though I didn't know it at the time, it set the stage for everything that would come next: the struggles, the triumphs, and the choices that would define who I was becoming. By the time my senior year of high school rolled around, life had already taught me more lessons than I ever wanted to learn. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that winter season, so cold it seemed to freeze not just the air but our very souls. It started with a phone call in the middle of the night, one of those shrill rings that pierce through your dreams and leave you gasping for breath. "Jenny," Grandma's voice trembled on the other end. "It's Grandpa. He's had a heart attack." I remember throwing on my coat over pajamas, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the buttons. The hospital was only 10 minutes away, but it felt like an eternity before we arrived. When we finally did, the sterile smell of antiseptic hit me like a punch to the gut. There he was, my quiet, strong Grandpa, lying pale and fragile in a bed surrounded by machines beeping ominously. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a struggle. For the first time in my life, I saw fear not just in his face, but in Grandma's too. She sat beside him, clutching his hand like if she let go, he might slip away forever. The doctors told us it was serious. They used words like critical condition and high-risk surgery, phrases that sounded distant yet carried the weight of doom. Surgery wasn't guaranteed to work, they warned, and even if it did, recovery would be long and uncertain. Money became the elephant in the room almost immediately. We didn't have insurance good enough to cover everything, and every conversation with the hospital staff ended with talk of bills, mountains of them. Grandma tried to hide her panic, but I could see it in the way her shoulders sagged when no one was looking. She took on extra shifts at both jobs, working herself into exhaustion while somehow still managing to bring meals to the hospital for me and Grandpa. For weeks, I barely left his side. Schoolwork piled up, missed exams loomed over me like storm clouds, but none of it mattered compared to the man fighting for his life in front of me. During the day, I read aloud from old books or recounted funny stories from school, hoping my voice might anchor him to this world. At night, I'd curl up in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his bed, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by nightmares where I lost him entirely. One particularly dark evening stands out vividly in my memory. Grandpa's condition had worsened overnight. The doctors said his body was struggling to recover. Exhausted and overwhelmed, I stepped out of the ICU to give Grandma some space. As I leaned against the hallway wall trying to steady my racing heart, I heard something that stopped me cold. From inside the dimly lit waiting area, Grandma's voice floated softly into the silence, a prayer whispered with such raw desperation it broke me completely. "God," she began, her tone trembling, "if there's any way, please take me instead. Let me go in his place. I can't lose him, I can't bear losing anyone else." Her words hung heavy in the air, each syllable laced with anguish. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. In that moment, I realized how much she had sacrificed not just now, but all these years for our family. And how much more she was willing to endure, even if it meant offering her own life. That night changed something inside me. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about protecting what little we had left. Watching Grandma pray like that made me understand the depth of her love and the unbearable burden she carried. I vowed then and there that I wouldn't let her shoulder it alone. If she could fight this hard, so could I. When Grandpa stabilized enough to come home, things weren't the same. He was weaker, slower, and needed constant care. I took charge of helping him regain strength, setting aside my own dreams of college and independence. Every morning, I helped him walk laps around the living room, cheering him on like it was the Olympics. Every night, I stayed up late researching affordable physical therapy exercises online, determined to make progress however small. Meanwhile, Grandma continued juggling her endless workload, though I could tell the strain was wearing her thin. But despite the exhaustion, guilt gnawed at me most. Guilt for wanting more, for dreaming of a future beyond this house, beyond the responsibilities tethering me here. Yet, whenever doubt crept in, I remembered Grandma's prayer. Those words echoed in my mind, reminding me why I couldn't give up. This was my family, my duty, my purpose. No matter how hard it got, I owed it to them to keep going. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening, shattering the fragile calm I had worked so hard to maintain. It was one of those moments where life decides it's time to throw another curveball, just when you think you've finally caught your breath. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through bills with Grandma when the shrill ring of the landline cut through the quiet hum of our small apartment. My heart sank before I even picked up the receiver. Something about unexpected calls always felt ominous. "Hello," I answered cautiously, bracing myself for whatever storm might follow. On the other end, a clipped, unfamiliar voice responded, "Is this Jennifer?" The tone was cold, clinical, like she was reading from a script but trying too hard to sound casual. Before I could respond, she continued, "I'm your father's wife." My stomach dropped. Wife, father. These words were foreign to me, relics of a man who had vanished from my life decades ago. For a moment, I couldn't speak. All I could hear was the echo of her words bouncing around in my head, each syllable dripping with implications I wasn't ready to face. She didn't waste any time getting to the point. Your father passed away in a car accident, she said flatly, as though delivering bad news was an everyday task for her. Her lack of emotion made my chest tighten, not sadness, but anger. How dare she act like she knew him better than I did? But then came the twist that turned my blood to ice. After rattling off details about the funeral and some vague condolences, she said, almost casually, "There's also the matter of inheritance." Inheritance. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. This man hadn't been part of my life since I was 5 years old, yet now his death somehow dragged me into a world I wanted no part of. And before I could process what she'd said, she added, her tone sharpening slightly, "If you're considering claiming anything, I suggest you reconsider. We can make things easier for everyone involved." Her thinly veiled threat hung heavy in the air between us. Easier. What exactly did that mean? But she didn't stop there. A few days later, an envelope arrived in the mail, a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a faded photograph of my father, standing beside a woman I assumed was her. Scrawled across the bottom in jagged handwriting were the words, "Don't think you deserve this." That single sentence ignited a firestorm inside me. Deserve? Who was she to decide what I deserved? She didn't know me. She didn't know the years I spent wondering why he left, the nights I cried myself to sleep after losing Mom, or the sacrifices Grandma and Grandpa made to give me a semblance of stability. To her, I was nothing more than an inconvenience, a loose end to tie up before she could claim everything for herself. For hours, I stared at the photo, my hands trembling with rage. Every fiber of my being screamed injustice. How dare she dismiss me like that? How dare she try to erase my existence with a few careless words? But beneath the anger was something deeper, raw, aching wound that refused to heal. No matter how much I told myself I didn't care about him, his abandonment still lingered in the corners of my mind, haunting me like a ghost I couldn't exorcise. And now, here was this woman, rubbing salt into that wound with cruel precision. When I showed the photo to Grandma, her reaction surprised me. Instead of comforting me, she clenched her jaw and muttered under her breath, "Typical." Then, looking directly at me, she said firmly, "Jenny, don't let her win. You are his daughter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her words struck a chord deep within me. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about money, it was about proving to myself, and to them, that I mattered. That my pain, my struggles, my very existence weren't insignificant. The next morning, I woke up with a newfound determination burning in my chest. If they thought they could intimidate me into backing down, they were wrong, dead wrong. I called the lawyer Grandma trusted, the same cousin who had helped us navigate the chaos after Grandpa's passing. His advice was simple but firm: stand your ground. They're bluffing or not. Their tactics were ruthless. Over the following weeks, letters poured in, aggressive demands, accusations questioning my legitimacy as his child, even hints of legal action if I didn't comply. Each letter felt like another brick added to the wall pressing down on me, but I refused to crumble. One night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I replayed every memory I had of Dad, or rather, the absence of him. The birthdays without presents, the parent-teacher meetings where Grandma sat alone, the endless questions I asked as a child that went unanswered. None of it mattered anymore. He owed me nothing. But I owed it to myself, to Grandma, and to Grandpa to fight back. Not because I wanted his money, but because I deserved respect. Respect for the family I built with Grandma, for the sacrifices we endured, and for the love that kept us together when the world tried to tear us apart. By the time I hung up the phone after consulting with the lawyer again, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and resolve. This battle wouldn't be easy, but I was done letting others dictate my worth. Whatever came next, I would face it head on. Because I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance, I was fighting for validation, for justice, and most importantly, for the family that had always stood by me. The legal battle that followed was nothing short of a war, a relentless, exhausting clash between two sides who couldn't have been more different. On one side stood me, Jenny, a 25-year-old woman raised by the sacrifices of her grandparents, fighting not just for money but for validation and justice. On the other side loomed my father's wife, armed with resources, connections, and an unyielding determination to claim everything for herself. She hired a high-profile lawyer known in legal circles as someone who could bend the law to fit his client's needs. His reputation preceded him: slick suits, sharp words, and a knack for twisting facts into narratives that favored his clients. From the moment he entered the fray, I knew this wouldn't be easy. It started subtly at first. Letters began arriving at our doorstep, each one more aggressive than the last. They accused me of fabricating documents, of lying about my relationship with my father, even of exploiting his death for personal gain. Every accusation felt like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless and angry. But it wasn't until one fateful afternoon that things escalated to a new level of absurdity and danger. I came home from work to find a plain white envelope waiting on the kitchen table. My name was scrawled across the front in unfamiliar handwriting, and something about it sent a chill down my spine. Inside, I found what appeared to be a forged will, a document supposedly written by my father before his death. It stated clearly that he intended to leave everything to his second wife, with no mention of me whatsoever. The audacity of it left me reeling. How dare they? How dare they try to erase me so completely, as if I had never existed? When I showed the document to our lawyer, the same cousin Grandma trusted, he immediately recognized it as a fake. "This is illegal," he said firmly, holding the paper up to the light to examine its authenticity. "They've crossed a line here, Jenny. Forging documents like this is fraud, plain and simple." While his words reassured me somewhat, they didn't ease the weight pressing down on my chest. This wasn't just about proving my rights anymore. It was about surviving a calculated attack designed to break me. As the weeks dragged on, the pressure mounted. Their lawyer filed motions, requested delays, and bombarded us with endless paperwork. Each move seemed calculated to wear me down, to make me question whether I had the strength to keep fighting. And then came the day of the hearing, a pivotal moment that would define the trajectory of the case. The courtroom was cold and sterile, its air thick with tension. I sat beside our lawyer, gripping the edge of the wooden bench so tightly my knuckles turned white. Across the aisle, my father's wife looked composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her lawyer paced back and forth, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. When the judge called the session to order, I felt my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. At one point during the proceedings, my father's wife took the stand. To my astonishment, she broke down in tears, her voice trembling as she recounted how devoted she had been to my father. "He was my entire world," she sobbed, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "I cared for him when no one else did. I stayed by his side through thick and thin. Doesn't that count for something?" Her performance was flawless, designed to paint herself as the victim, a loving spouse betrayed by a greedy daughter who barely knew her own father. For a moment, I froze. Her words stung, not because they were true, but because they hit too close to the painful truth of my childhood, the years I spent wondering why my father had abandoned me. The birthdays and holidays where he should have been present but wasn't. But then, something inside me snapped. "No," I thought fiercely. "She doesn't get to twist this story. Not today." When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, my legs shaking beneath me. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward me. Taking a deep breath, I began, my voice quivering but resolute. "You can't pretend to be the victim when you're the one trying to take away what belongs to me," I said, locking eyes with her. "My father may not have been part of my life, but that doesn't mean I don't deserve what's rightfully mine. You've lied, manipulated, and gone to extreme lengths to deny me my inheritance. And now, you expect me to believe that you cared more about him than anyone else. That's not love, that's greed." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the judge seemed taken aback by the raw emotion in my voice. My father's wife stared at me, her expression unreadable, but I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. After the hearing, our lawyer pulled me aside. "That was powerful," he said, a rare smile breaking through his usually stoic demeanor. "You stood your ground, and it showed." The judge noticed. Though the case wasn't over yet, I could feel the tide turning in our favor. But the victory came at a cost. The stress of the trial weighed heavily on Grandma, whose health had already been fragile after years of hard work and loss. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, she placed a gentle hand on mine. "Jenny," she said softly, "you've done enough. Don't let this consume you." Her words struck a chord deep within me. I realized then that while this fight was necessary, it couldn't define my entire existence. There had to be more to life than this constant struggle. The final stretch of the legal battle felt like an endless storm, one that battered not just my resolve but also the fragile foundation of our family. Every day brought new challenges, letters from their lawyers, aggressive phone calls, and the constant weight of knowing that this fight was consuming us piece by piece. But nothing prepared me for the day everything came crashing down in a way I hadn't anticipated. It happened on a rainy afternoon, the kind where the sky seemed to press down on you with its heaviness. I had just returned home after another grueling shift at work when the phone rang. It was the neighbor, her voice trembling as she delivered the news. Grandma had been in a car accident. My heart stopped. "She's okay," the neighbor quickly added, sensing my panic, "but you should come to the hospital right away." This wasn't just an accident. It was a direct consequence of the toll this inheritance battle had taken on her. That night, as I helped her into bed, I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at me. Her frail frame, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her cup of tea, it all screamed of how much she'd sacrificed for me. And now, because of my stubbornness to fight for what was right, she was paying the price. For the first time, I questioned whether any of this was worth it. Was winning really more important than protecting the people I loved? But then, something shifted. A few days later, my lawyer called with unexpected news. They were offering a settlement, 50-50, no further contest. At first, I hesitated, unsure if accepting meant giving up too easily. But deep down, I knew we couldn't keep going like this, not without destroying ourselves completely. When I told Grandma about the offer, she simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "Do what feels right, Jenny," she said softly. "We've fought enough." Signing the agreement felt surreal, like closing a chapter one never wanted to open in the first place. As part of the process, we received boxes of documents related to my father's estate. Among them, tucked inside an old folder, was a letter addressed to me. My hands shook as I unfolded it, recognizing his handwriting instantly. The date stamped on top revealed it had been written years ago, shortly after he remarried. In the letter, he admitted things I'd spent my entire life wondering about. He confessed that leaving us wasn't a decision made lightly, it was born out of fear and shame. "I failed you, Jenny," he wrote, "and your grandmother and grandfather. I didn't know how to face you after your mother passed. I thought running would make things easier, but it only made me realize how much I lost." His words were raw, filled with regret and sorrow. He talked about wanting to reach out countless times, but being too afraid of rejection. Reading it broke something inside me. A dam of emotions I'd held back for so long finally burst. Tears streamed down my face as I sat there, clutching the paper tightly. Part of me wanted to scream, to rage against the years of silence and abandonment. But another part felt relief, not forgiveness, not yet, but clarity. For the first time, I understood that his absence wasn't entirely about me, it was about his own inability to confront his mistakes. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it softened the edges, making it bearable. When I showed the letter to Grandma, she read it silently, her lips trembling. After a long pause, she looked at me and said, "He was human, Jenny, flawed, scared, and selfish, but still human. Don't let his choices define you." Her words stayed with me long after she left the room. They reminded me that while the past shaped us, it didn't have to control us. As the dust settled, I realized the money wasn't what mattered most. Yes, it allowed Grandma to retire comfortably, easing some of the burdens we'd carried for years. But the real victory lay in standing up for myself, for my family, and refusing to let anyone take advantage of us. We may not have gotten everything we deserved, but we got enough, and sometimes that's all you can ask for. After the dust settled from the inheritance battle, Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, or at least, that's what it looked like on the surface. The house was quieter now, without the constant phone calls or legal letters piling up on the kitchen table. Grandma finally retired from her endless string of part-time jobs, spending her days tending to the garden and reading books she had long neglected. For the first time in years, I saw her smile without the weight of worrying pulling at the corners of her lips. It should have been enough to bring me peace, but instead, an unsettling restlessness began creeping into my thoughts. I realized, with startling clarity, that I didn't know how to live for myself anymore. Years of sacrifice for Grandma, for Grandpa, even for a father who wasn't there had left me unsure of where I fit into this new chapter of life. Every decision I made seemed tied to someone else's needs. What did I want? Where did I belong? These questions haunted me as I wandered through the empty rooms of our home, feeling both physically and emotionally adrift. One evening, after dinner, Grandma caught me staring out the window, lost in thought. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and said softly, "Jenny, you've done so much for all of us. Now it's time for you to think about yourself." Her words startled me because they echoed something deep inside that I'd been avoiding. "I don't even know where to start," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if I fail? What if I can't figure it out?" She smiled, though there was sadness in her eyes. "Failure isn't the worst thing, Jenny. Sometimes, it's just another step forward. You've already shown more strength than most people ever will. Don't let fear stop you now." Her advice stayed with me, but it didn't make the path ahead any clearer. Over the next few weeks, I tried to imagine what my future could look like. Could I go back to school, travel somewhere far away, start a career that excited me? Each possibility felt overwhelming, like standing at the edge of a cliff and being too afraid to jump. I found myself paralyzed by indecision, trapped between the comfort of familiarity and the terror of stepping into the unknown. Then came the night when I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, staring at my reflection as if searching for answers written across my face. My eyes were tired, shadowed by sleepless nights spent wrestling with doubt and uncertainty. Who was I outside of the roles I'd played? Granddaughter, caretaker, fighter. Was everything I had endured worth it? The question lingered heavily in the air, unanswered. And yet, despite the turmoil swirling inside me, I forced a small smile onto my lips. Not because I felt happy, but because I needed to remind myself of one truth: survival wasn't just about winning battles. It was about enduring them. Through every loss, every betrayal, every moment of despair, I had kept moving forward. That resilience, that stubborn refusal to give up, was its own kind of victory. The next morning, I woke up determined to take one small step toward change. I signed up for a community art class, a hobby I'd once loved but abandoned during high school when responsibilities took over. Sitting among strangers, holding a paintbrush for the first time in years, I felt awkward and out of place. Yet, as colors blended together on the canvas, I discovered a flicker of joy I hadn't felt in ages. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, a tiny piece of creation born from chaos. Grandma noticed the shift in me almost immediately. "You seem lighter," she remarked one afternoon while we sat together on the porch. "Like you're finally letting go of something." "Maybe I am," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure what that something was. Perhaps it was guilt, or fear, or the belief that my worth was tied solely to how much I sacrificed for others. Whatever it was, releasing it even partially felt liberating. As weeks turned into months, I began exploring other interests, volunteering at a local shelter, taking long walks alone to clear my mind, writing letters to no one in particular. Slowly, I started piecing together fragments of a life that belonged to me, not to anyone else. It wasn't easy. There were days when doubt crept back in, whispering cruel reminders of past failures. But each time, I reminded myself of the lessons I'd learned, that strength isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes, it's quiet and steady, like breathing through pain until the storm passes. Looking back, I realized the greatest gift I received wasn't the inheritance, it was the understanding that life is messy, and fair, and unpredictable. And yet, within that chaos lies opportunity to grow, to heal, to redefine ourselves. I may never fully understand why certain things happen the way they did, but I've come to accept that some questions don't have answers, and that's okay. If there's one lesson I hope others take from my story, it's this: don't wait until everything feels perfect to start living for yourself. Life rarely hands us neat resolutions or tidy endings. But even in the midst of struggle, there is beauty in the courage to keep going, in the connections we forge, and in the moments of light that break through the darkness. Be brave enough to face your fears, patient enough to forgive yourself, and strong enough to believe that your journey matters, no matter how uncertain it may feel.